Hello, I'm Robin Hunn, and I'll be making a broadcast for today from my garden, as you can see. The topic we've been given is to talk about magic in modern society. Not a subject I know an immense amount about, so I've spoken to various friends, including Nick Ford, who knows an awful lot about just virtually every subject under the sun. And one of the things he suggested, which is what I'm going to talk about, is the role played by purification and cleansing ceremonies within modern paganism. It's probably true of ancient paganism as well, but obviously we'll focus on modern paganism because it's modern society. And there's a couple of angles I want to come at this from, and it's mostly in terms of raising issues for discussion, rather than me giving you my sort of so-called informed views about the various subjects I'm going to talk about. In the first instance, what I want to explore and look at is the idea that within quite a number of different pagan traditions, Wicca and Druidry come to mind as immediate examples, but there are other pagan traditions that do the same. People gather in a place, the woodland, grove, someone's back garden, wherever it might be, and they prepare the place for the ritual that's to take place, that's to occur. They engage in acts of physical tidying up, sweeping things away and so on, but also in acts of spiritual purification to cleanse the place of any, what used to be called back in the 60s, negative vibrations, but obviously other more current terms apply now. And sometimes people prepare themselves, they focus themselves, they cleanse themselves, they have lustral baths, this sort of thing, and focus their minds and cleanse themselves of, and I'm trying to avoid using the word energy here because I know it upsets physicists who have a much more precise use of that term, but negative states of mind that they want to cleanse and get rid of to focus themselves and prepare themselves for the ritual that's about to take place. So the first question I want to think of in this context is, if we are moving negative force, negative presence, negative emotional states, whatever you want to call it, whether it's from a geographic location or whether it's from our own internal being, we're moving them somewhere else. Where do they go to? And what happens to them when they get there? If we're thinking for the moment, let's take the geographic example. We've got a woodland glade, you're preparing it, you're moving the negative energy out. If, in your mind as a practitioner, the idea is that you sweep the energy away, and rather like sweeping up leaves, it just kind of goes to the edge, and then when the ritual's over and you go home, you go wherever, it just floods back in. That's fine, there's no immediate obvious problem with that, because it's a temporary displacement and then it returns to where it was before. If, on the other hand, you're seeing it more in terms of removing the energy entirely, that it's being broken down, it's being destroyed, maybe you envision it as being something like leaves falling from trees and then decaying to mulch on the forest floor, that this psychic pattern, shall we say, breaks apart and that energy dissipates somewhere else. That again is not necessarily a problem, because it is perhaps returning to the natural cycle, it's becoming broken down into its constituent parts, it's ceasing to be a negative presence, it's becoming a neutralised or even maybe a positive presence. However, what might be a potential problem is if you visualise that the energy you're moving is actually going somewhere else. Now, whether that is somewhere else within the material world that we're used to, so you move it from one part of the woodland to some other part of the woodland, or whether you see it more as in terms of spiritual planes, that you're moving it from this spiritual plane to some other spiritual plane, some other world, some other dimension, however you want to phrase that. How do you know precisely where it's going and whether it's welcome when it gets there? One way of thinking about this is the idea that you're clearing up your garden and you're throwing all of the old litter over the fence into the neighbour's garden. So it's out of your garden, it's somewhere else, and you don't think about it anymore because you can't see it. That neighbour might be annoyed at what you're doing. If you're moving unpleasant presences and forces somewhere else, whoever lives in that somewhere else, whether it's another part of the woodland, whether it's another dimension of existence, they might not want that negative energy dumped on them. They might be the irate neighbour thinking, who is hurling all this crap over the fence? Why are they doing it? It might cause problems then, and clearly that creates an ethical dilemma that has to be addressed. A secondary follow-on aspect of that is the idea that these forces, shall we say, when they arrive in another dimension, might be considered useful in some way by presences, beings in the place they're being moved to. Just as we put rubbish in the bin and it's taken to rubbish tips miles and miles away and it's dumped there, sometimes in this country and apparently sometimes local councils ship it off to other parts of the world, often to the third world, where it's piled up in gargantuan mounds. And whether you've been to these places on holiday or you've just seen it on the news, you may well be familiar with images of these sort of village-sized mounds of filth with human beings living in it. So it's not just the seagulls pecking at it, there's whole families, lots of children and elderly people and so on, in desperate, grinding poverty, who are scraping an existence by picking food out of the waste, by finding objects that they might be able to repair and sell on, living off other people's filth. When we're transporting energy, forces, whatever, to somewhere else, are there beings in that place who find it useful? They might find it useful in the way that wombles rearrange things, or, slightly more concerning, they may be feasting upon it, much like the seagulls eating the food waste in rubbish tins. What kind of creatures feast off the sorts of energies we want to get rid of? Hatred, anger, despair, misery, doom and gloom. Are those creatures likely to be healthy beings to be around as they get bigger and stronger and well fed on all of this displaced unhappiness and despondency? That's a question to reflect on. It potentially could lead to unhealthy consequences if those entities are getting more and more powerful and stronger and develop a taste for what they're consuming and aren't content just to sit and wait for random passing pagans and other mystics to displace energy. They actually come out seeking for it, seeking to predate upon it. A number of people, myself included, have witnessed this phenomena of entities that latch on to people, particularly people with addictions and things like that, and feed off of their unhappiness and actually make them more unhappy in the process and make it much harder for that person to ever recover. So they're sort of parasitic entities that consume human unhappiness and encourage unhappiness in the process of consuming it. So that's worth contemplating a little bit. Another aspect I would like to get you to think about is this idea that negative energy is not a clear-cut concept. What is negative in the first place? It's a tired old analogy to draw on the oyster with the pearl, but the creation of a pearl often very nearly kills the oyster in the process. Just as negative events in many people's lives can become transformative. It can lead to something positive in the long term. They become more compassionate people, it inspires art, it inspires them to invent things which resolve their problems, it changes their lives in all sorts of unexpected positive ways, as well as bringing suffering and unhappiness in the process. And it is raining if you're wondering what the noise is. If we cleanse ourselves of negativity very quickly before it's had a chance to bring anything positive into our life as well, then maybe we will lose out on the opportunity to acquire the pearl, to acquire whatever the positive force might have been, had we endured the unhappiness a little bit longer. So that's a potential issue in itself. The other side of the coin is how we define what constitutes negative in the first place. A couple of days ago, before making this recording, we had the absolutely horrific massacre take place in Orlando where around about 50 people have been gunned down, and many, many more horribly injured in the process, by someone fueled, clearly, with a very deep hatred of the LGBT community. For century upon century upon century, we've had Christianity and Islam and a number of other religions condemning LGBT people, condemning homosexuality, condemning gender variance and that sort of thing. And people growing up within those cultures, hearing those views and attitudes preached from pulpits and reading about it in holy books and so on and so forth, have grown up believing those things to be evil and sinful and terrible and wicked and awful. And for those of them who then experienced attraction to their own sex, who experienced gender variance and similar things, they may well have grown up hating and resenting and fearing that very part of themselves, and wanting to cure themselves, if we can put it like that, whether that was by seeking medical help, clearly ineffective, or whether that was going to a priest or an imam or a practitioner of some kind of folk magic tradition who is offered to exorcise whatever spirits are causing them to be gay or causing them to be transgendered, who's praying to make them straight or praying to make them this, praying to make them that. All sorts of sham treatments and cures and responses are offered to people who believe themselves to have something deeply negative in their character, when other people, such as myself and many other people around the world, see it as completely positive, as something to be valued and prized as part of our core identity of who we are, something that brings love and creativity and passion and inspiration and so on and so forth. So what to some people is deeply negative, to others is very positive. So one thing I'd like us to think about is, when we say, I want to get rid of this negative presence in my life, is it actually genuinely negative? Or is it that you've been conditioned by cultural exposure after generation after generation after generation of people saying, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, for whatever reasons, whether it's religious reasons or political reasons or something else entirely, and it's convinced you that this part of your life, this part of yourself, is a negative thing, when maybe, had you grown up in some other culture with a different set of values being exposed to you, you might have seen it in a much more positive light. So it's just taking that step back to look at the situation that's causing you grief, to think, why is it causing grief? And is banishing it, getting rid of it, necessarily the best response? Might there be other better responses that could be taken than just that one? There are other issues I could waffle on about, but I've got to go get dinner ready. So I will leave you to think about that, and maybe you can bounce around all sorts of ideas and feedback and share ideas amongst each other. This is just to start a conversation going. So thank you for listening.